Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. I'm Georgina Downer and I'm the host of Afternoon Light. Each week I speak to leading thinkers from around the world about Robert Menzies, his life, his era and his enduring legacy. Hello, and on today's episode of Afternoon Light, I'm talking to Paul Williams, who is an Associate Professor in the School of Humanities, Languages and Social Science at Griffith University, and he is also the author of a monograph on John Gorton, Australian to the Bootheels, which was published about 18 months ago. And this podcast is part of a series we are doing on the successes of Menzies. So, Paul, it's wonderful to have you on the podcast today to discuss your thoughts on John Gorton.
Thank you, Georgine. It's a real privilege to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, well, we were just saying before, I was really enjoying learning more about John Gorton, who is, as you were saying, a bit of a polarising figure. But what is fascinating, I think, to start with, is his childhood. One of the many Prime Ministers of Australia who loses a parent young in life, and there's theories about how that changes their life direction or makes them want people to love them more. And I won't get into the pop psychology, but tell me about Gorton's interesting early years and background.
Yeah, indeed. One of the arguments I make in the book is that John Gorton's whole life was really a series of paradoxes. And one of the great paradoxes is found even in his early years. So he sort of oscillated between quite a privileged background and quite a poor background, depending on who he was spending time with. First of all, he was born out of wedlock at a time early in the second decade of the 20th century, at a time when being born out of wedlock was considered a great shame. But that's something that John Gorton never really shied away from. He freely admitted it to his first biographer in the late 60s, Alan Trengrove. So he never shied away from it, never seemed to be embarrassed by it, and more or less wore it on his sleeve, I suppose. So that was the first paradox, that he was able to excel despite what people at the time would have considered a handicap. He was also born to a father who was some would say a bit of a scoundrel. So he was involved in the nightclub business and had various adventures around the world. So he was a bit of a Errol Flynn type scallywag in his own time, and who then settled down in Victoria to become running an orchard. And he had a mercurial income. So he, sometimes he had money, sometimes he didn't. And whether or not he was still married when he had a relationship with Gorton's mother is still a question to be answered. Was John Senior, John Rose Gorton was John Grace Gorton's father. Was he a bigamist and married Alice, or perhaps did he have this affair? But anyway, John Gorton was seemingly married out of wedlock, and he was raised at times in a very plush upper crust Melburnian society, and went to very plush upper crust schools. And then sometimes he would spend times with his maternal grandparents, and they lived in very impoverished circumstances. And so he would oscillate between these two households. And more to the point, his mother died, who he absolutely adored his mother when he was a very young boy, certainly under the age of 10. And even Gorton himself talked about the attractiveness of his mother. And he felt this loss severely. His father was, as many fathers were those days, emotionally hands-off. And then he was sent to live with John Rose's first wife in Sydney. And, of course, she didn't really care for him. And later on, he met a sister he didn't know that he had. So it was a very unusual childhood, and it seems to be very short on emotion. It's very short on love, a very austere, emotionally austere. While there was plenty of money, at least at times, because he was going to these upper middle class exclusive schools, certainly emotionally it was a very austere time. And so the theory goes, and I've applied this theory, it's called deprivational theory in leadership psychology, political psychology, that a lot of people who feel that they are denied love in childhood externalise that love onto public audiences in order to compensate for that deprivation of love and emotion in their childhood. And some people say this, and lacking a warm maternal figure in his life after the loss of his mother, some say might have driven Gorton to have extramarital affairs and to seek the attention of women. And, it's always well known that Gorton preferred the company of women at a party and often sought their political advice when women weren't considered, politically savvy people. So Gorton naturally gravitated to women more than men, despite being a very masculine figure who played sport and drank and loved to party. So the theory goes that he sought to compensate in a couple of ways for his emotionally deprived childhood. One, by seeking out the company of women, and two, to become a politician. If he couldn't get the love to fulfill him as a child, he would try and get the love from the Australian people. And look, I think there's something to that. I know that, as you say, the pop psychology of this can be a little bit flaky, but I think there's something to it because, again, if you look at the number of members of parliament over the decades, over the century, federal members of parliament, you see a disproportionate number of these federal members are firstborn in their family. So that they become leadership figures inside their own family, as it were, raising or helping to raise younger children. So look, I think there's no doubt that childhood experiences shape the future political animal.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, Harold Holt also lost a parent at a young age and was said to be constantly seeking the affection of others. So who knows? But yeah, so Sydney Grammar and Geelong Grammar, and then on to Oxford. He's got a pretty elite educational background. He goes to Oxford, doesn't he? And he meets an American. Yeah. So that's really interesting. So Bettina Brown, who becomes Bettina Gorton, how much, and again, this is pop psychology, but let's engage. How much do you think being married to an American influenced a lot of his attitudes to Britain and the motherland? Because he's really, throughout his career, isn't he, he's distinguishing himself from Menzies, I'm British to my boot heels. Gorton is Australian to his boot heels. He has a scepticism of the British, and when you read about his trips to Britain as Prime Minister, he's certainly not sold on the Commonwealth to start with, or sold on aligning Australia with Britain.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's no doubt that it gave him a more global view, being married to a young American. And, of course, Bettina was his mate's sister. So he obviously knew the brother and also would have been influenced. So I think at an early age, he developed an interest in foreign policy, developed an interest in global affairs, and, again, leaving home at a young age to go to Oxford. And again, this experience wasn't just about, I suppose, broadening his cultural experiences, but also his political experiences, because we see, Gorton at this time was exposed to political extremism. He saw the horrors of Stalinism in the 1930s and developed an early hatred of communism, or at least the Soviet version thereof. He also saw Oswald Mosley's fascists and despised them as well. So he became a liberal in the true sense of the word. He was, he championed the rights of the individual, championed the rights of freedom. He was very worried about the powers of an authoritarian state. And again, many American characteristics of American political culture also uphold this about, the power of the individual, the freedom of choice. And I think there's no doubt that to be exposed to Americans and other people outside the Anglo-Australian sphere would have influenced him as well. And there's no doubt that Bettina was a great counterbalance, I think, to John. And, she was her own woman and a strong woman. Sadly, she passed away long before John did, in 1983, I believe it was. And John did marry again before he died. But I think it was a very strong partnership, and John Gray did acknowledge that he did stray from the marriage and have extramarital affairs. But I think it's testimony to the strength of their relationship that they maintained a union for so long despite that adversity.
Yeah, well, and interestingly, I think you reveal in your book that Bettina's brother ends up being a member of the Communist Party, which is quite extraordinary given John Gorton's antipathy to communism. It was really quite sort of a feature of his political views. So John Gorton's, as you say, he's a liberal. He's definitely not a conservative. But he goes after returning from Oxford to become a farmer, doesn't he? In northern Victoria, I think he inherits a citrus orchard from his father, and
he does.
and goes up there thinking he thought he might be a journalist, and that didn't seem to work. So off he goes to be an orchardist. And the Country Party is quite big in Victoria. Why does he not join the Country Party and join the Menzies Liberals, and he's joining them in the 40s, isn't he? So he's, this is an early beginning of the Liberal Party. So what attracts him to this new political project?
Well, he was a member of the Country Party very briefly, very early on, before his, we might say his political forms or political values were completely established. And again, like so many people, he would have just followed in his father's footsteps. He would have considered himself a primary producer, a farmer. And I think probably it was more of the behest of his father's and the industry he thought he was going to end up in rather than anything else. But it is interesting that a man who developed a global perspective and, had even done things like earned a pilot's license when he was a young man in Oxford, should return to more or less to the bosom of the family back in rural Victoria. So it's a very parochial thing for a man who just graduated from Oxford with a master's degree. But having, as I said, he sort of toyed with the idea of journalism, but that didn't work out. He also sat, the Foreign Service exam, but had failed the exam. Despite him being a very intelligent man and just earned a master's degree, he often did things, I think, unprepared. And he failed the exam. So I think it was perhaps just a natural progression that, I'll go back to where it's safe. What do I know best? I know farming on Dad's orchard. But he did join the Country Party very early on. But I believe, my understanding is that he saw the Country Party as too stultifying, too conservative, not really where the action was. And for listeners outside of Victoria, you've got to remember that the relationship between the then Country Party and Liberal Party was not as harmonious as it was, say, in New South Wales, Queensland or elsewhere. So it has its own checkered history. But I think that the idea being that somehow that John Gorton was an accidental politician is a false one.
Right.
And I think John tried to carve out his own career and saw that the future lay with this new Liberal Party. And, it didn't take long. He was elected to the Kerrang Shire, then became president, and it was only a matter of years before he was a Senate candidate on a Liberal ticket. So there's no doubt that he saw the Liberal Party as the pathway to success.
Did he run in the 46 election as well as the 49?
I don't believe so. I think he was still in the Kerrang Shire at that stage.
Right.
And he made such a splash in local politics that, the boffins in Liberal Party headquarters in Melbourne started to notice him. Oh. So there's no doubt that if he just walked off the farm and into, Liberal Party headquarters looking for pre-selection, he wouldn't have got it. I think that local apprenticeship that he served really sealed the pre-selection for him. And again, he wasn't top of the ticket in 49. He had to wait some time before he'd be top of the Victorian ticket. But of course, there was a big swing to the Liberals in 49, as we know, and also the introduction of proportional representation, which made it easier for other candidates to be elected. So it was really a serendipitous combination of factors that allowed John Gray to come forward. And plus he was making all sorts of, he was a very profound and very good speech maker. Again, that's another paradox. I mean, a lot of people of a certain year remember John Gorton as having very convoluted syntax and tortured grammar and not a very good speech maker at all. But
oh, really?
His early speeches are very, very good. And, of course, a lot of those early speeches were hardline, hawkish, anti-communist speeches, and that attracted the interest of the Victorian Liberal Party as well.
So he's elected to federal parliament as a senator for Victoria in 1949 when there's a huge influx of new members of parliament. Obviously, the first time the Liberal Party has won an election. They contested the election in 46 unsuccessfully. So they win in 49. A lot of them are ex-servicemen, including Gorton, including my grandfather, Alec Downer. So Gorton comes to the parliament with a pretty typical background of a 49er, doesn't he? He's pretty representative of the group.
I think so. And again, that war service was absolutely important. It was worth its weight in gold, really, reputationally, to have an ethos of war service in the parliament. And that lasted throughout the 50s and 60s. A funny anecdote about that. Gorton was never short of self-confidence, as we know. And Gorton was asked when he was first elected as a senator for Victoria, what do you think of your colleagues? And he wryly replied, not much, I'm the best of them. Now, that might be a throwaway line, but I think Gorton was probably telling more truth, and he wasn't trying to be funny. I think he really believed that. Gorton was fond of also saying when he was Prime Minister, what do you say to people who disagree with you? Because you run the cabinet like a president. He said, well, I always say there's 2 points of view, mine and the one that's not right. So he was. Gorton never lacked confidence, no. And I think that instilled. I think a lot of people admired that, and today we might call it cocky, at a time when everyone was very well behaved in politics. This is the time of Menzies and button and three-piece suits, and journalists calling Robert Menzies Mr. Menzies. It was a time of great politeness and erudition. I think that people liked an Australian who could stand tall above the poppies.
Yeah. And he had due to a accident, I think he crashed his plane, didn't he, when he was in the RAF 4 times. He had quite a rugged, craggy looking face. I mean, quite a lovely looking face in a way, quite handsome, but he had a kind of a ruggedness that was such a contrast to Menzies, who was so as you say, double-breasted suits and so proper and dignified.
Absolutely. I mean, yes, poor old John did actually crash his plane 3 times, but he had 4 near-death experiences because he was shot down by a Japanese Zero, and when he crash-landed the plane, his face slammed into the instrument panel, and this was a time long before
craniofacial
surgery.
Yeah.
He was an early recipient of pretty rudimentary plastic surgery, but on his way to being shipped to hospital, the ship that had rescued him was actually torpedoed, and he was on an island off the north of Australia living on turtle eggs. And he had a couple of other minor crashes too, flipped a plane. And on the 4th time, he said, well, that's enough for me. I'm going to become an instructor.
So maybe his skills weren't quite there. Well, teach people how to crash planes instead.
Absolutely, and I think that even then he realised that the time wasn't on his side. He was very lucky in that respect.
Very lucky.
He became an instructor, and one of the points I argue in the book is that I think that these near-death experiences also formulated and also shaped his outcome, as it did for a lot of service men and women. If war couldn't kill me, nothing can, and they adopt a sense of boldness, and I call it insouciance. So he had an insouciance towards what other people thought of him. It's crash through a crash, and which is a title applied to Gough Whitlam, who was also in the Second World War. He was a navigator in the Air Force. So I think that for a lot of service people, there was a boldness, that there's a toughness, that if war couldn't kill me, nothing can. But also this I think overlapped into Gorton's personal relationships. He had an insouciance towards to the extent where he didn't even care what his friends thought about him. So it really was, and Gorton was always attributed with the song, the Frank Sinatra song, I Did It My Way. And I think that's at the core. He really didn't care what people thought. And I think a lot of that is rooted in his wartime experiences. But again, that paradoxically, that's in contrast to his desire to be loved from his childhood. So as I said, John Gorton is an incredibly complicated man. His whole life, private and public, wrought with many paradoxes.
Yeah. So he enters Parliament in 49, but he doesn't actually get into the ministry, and we're talking outer ministry, until 58. So he's not quick in his elevation through the ranks in the Menzies era, which is interesting. Does that indicate there were problems with his relationship with Menzies? Because Menzies would have known him pretty well. They're both from Victoria.
Yes.
I can't imagine Gorton was a shrinking violet in the party room. No. So
and that may have worked against him.
Yeah.
There's a couple of reasons for that. The first one is that there was a lot of talent. The Liberal Party in the 1950s and early 60s had a lot of talent. Labor was depleted. It wasn't giving the Liberals often had big majorities, except from 61, of course. The Liberals were nearly defeated in 61, but the Labor Party was a divided and pretty hapless and hopeless opposition. There was a lot of talent in the Liberal Party in the 50s, so there was lots of human resources from which Menzies could draw. So it was tough competition to win Menzies' favour. And the second point is, you're quite right. I think there was, I don't know if it's too much to say there was a strained relationship, but Gorton certainly wasn't inside Menzies' inner circle. They were generationally different, but then again, so were many others. Even people who were close to Menzies, like Holt, they still deferred to Menzies. They still saw him as a father figure. They were still deeply respectful. They rarely questioned his judgment because it was his party, as Gerard Henderson said. If the party was his child, it's a very brave minister who calls Menzies out on a point. But in the party room, John Gorton occasionally did, and he would challenge the Prime Minister to, why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? And when he was given certain responsibilities. I think one of the first responsibilities Menzies gave him was to navigate an amendment to the marriage bill through the Senate, Marriage Act through the Senate, and Gorton had his own interpretation as to how this should be argued and framed. And I think that stuck in the craw of Menzies a little bit. But Menzies, being the respecter of Westminster traditions that he was, gave his ministers latitude. So I think Menzies was a great believer in ministerial government as well as cabinet government, and didn't need to interfere in the life of ministers because they wanted to please the boss anyway. But I think at the end of the day, Menzies respected Gorton, but at the same time perhaps didn't quite fully trust Gorton, because Gorton could be a loose cannon and certainly could be critical in the party room. And again, it comes down to this point about, I don't think Gorton was really afraid of anything or anyone, and he was his own man to the end. So I think that was part and parcel of why Gorton was passed over. He could be a little bit of a thorn in Menzies' side in the party room.
Yeah, and so he's eventually given his first portfolio in 58 responsibility for the Navy. And I think you're right that he later claimed he'd built the modern Navy in the 5 years he held that portfolio, which is, quite a claim. But what he, I think, is most notably remembered for is his contribution to education, which, of course, I think Menzies says when he retires, his greatest legacy was what the Menzies government did for education in Australia, doubling the number of universities during that time, tripling the number of university students attending university, in quite an extraordinary expansion of the tertiary education system during the Menzies years. But what do you think were Gorton's major achievements in that education portfolio?
Yeah, again, the education portfolio was a strange beast for 1966. It was only Holt that had a standalone education portfolio and recognised it at cabinet level. Until before 1966, there was still this constitutional grey area over whether the Commonwealth can legislate and act on educational matters, because under Section 51 of the Constitution, there's nothing about education there. So it was a residual power left over for the states. And, of course, this all came to a head. Well, the universities, of course, had been under the auspices of the Commonwealth, even though state parliaments had to pass establishing legislation to get universities off the ground. But this came to a head. Education policy from Canberra came to a head in 1963 when the Menzies government said, we're going to start funding non-government schools, particularly Catholic schools. And, of course, that only sort of deepened the divide in the Labor Party between those who believed that the Labor Party was helping Catholics and those who were not helping Catholics, and so on. And it won, again, another generation of Catholic voters over to the Liberals, because the Menzies was funding Catholic schools, and the Labor policy officially was governments don't support private schools. And so that fell into John Gorton's lap as well. He had the power to do that. But Gorton could claim great success in terms of things like number of scholarships, number of Year 12 completions, funding for schools and things like sports equipment, which, again, interestingly, Gough Whitlam picked up that baton and ran with that after 1972. And Gorton was a recipient of the best of educations at the primary, secondary, and tertiary level himself. He knew the value of education. He knew it was a great liberator of the class system. So Gorton despised the class system, even though he himself was clearly, by any definition, upper middle class Australian, privileged background. He said very famously, I'm not part or of the establishment. And this is a man who was a member of the Melbourne Club. He was a Prime Minister.
Yeah.
He reached the top of everything he touched turned to gold. But he always said he wasn't part of the establishment. So Gorton was very uncomfortable, I think, with class politics. He loved the ordinary Australian. One anecdote I remember was about, he went to a dance which included Indigenous Australians at a time when, just after the 1967 referendum. So there was certain, cultural and social discrimination against Aboriginal people. And Gorton just loved going to the dance. He wanted to dance with all the young Indigenous women. He really despised racism, classism, sexism. He really did try and break down those barriers long before a lot of his contemporaries in politics did. But at the same time, he also held some fairly paternalistic attitudes towards people who are different as well. Again, just adds another paradox.
Yeah, well, I guess, ultimately people are of their day, aren't they? There are lots of criticisms levelled against Menzies, but I think you've got to consider the prevailing view at the time, and Menzies reflected on race and immigration, the women, a lot of the prevailing views at the time, and you can judge people by the standards of contemporary Australia if they lived 100 years ago, but let's be honest, they didn't live in contemporary Australia, so they don't have the views necessarily that we do. Gorton's journey to the Prime Ministership is extraordinary. I mean, we're obviously dealing with the tragic death and sudden death of Harold Holt drowning in Victoria off the coast of the Mornington Peninsula and all the fallout from that. But he's a senator. He's not exactly considered the absolute front runner, especially as people wouldn't have expected a senator to pop into the Prime Ministership. Tell me about this journey and how he makes it.
Yeah, this is an extraordinary story, isn't it? And it's prefaced by another story that if the first story or first set of events hadn't occurred, the second set of events wouldn't have occurred. Very late 67, we know that Harold Holt's getting tired. He's losing popularity. The Liberals did quite poorly in the half-Senate election in 1967. And one of the things that Harold Holt does as a circuit breaker is to appoint John Gorton as government leader in the Senate because he's got a reputation of being articulate, being a bit of a head kicker, getting things done. He's becoming a powerful man not to be messed with, and Harold Holt recognises this. And pretty much the same time as he's appointed, the government's undergoing arguably its biggest crisis. So again, the Holt government's less than 2 years old. And it's 66, of course. It won its biggest majority, the Liberals' biggest majority ever. And the Labor Party was completely dejected. 67, first part of 67, still going okay. But by the second half of 67, the wheels start coming off the Holt government. And Holt himself is getting very nervous and anxious and losing control. And one of the things that's destabilising the Holt government is the Prime Minister and his Air Minister, Peter Howson's insistence that certain VIP flight manifests do not exist. The Labor Party is calling for the tabling of a number of documents, the VIP flight manifests about how politicians can hop on a VIP aircraft and go anywhere they want. And this is at a time when Australians were starting to think, oh, Polly's got their snouts in the trough, privileged elites, we don't like it. So Labor thinks they can smell blood in the water by going after and these flight manifests just to find out how many of these politicians are getting these privileged flights. Problematically, instead of just fessing up, Holt and Air Minister Howson don't table and go further and say they don't exist. And, of course, in the late 60s, there was a much more aggressive news media. You've got Four Corners in the early 1960s. You've got the AM and PM programs on ABC radio. You've got journalists asking not just what happened, but how and why things happened, becoming much more aggressive. And, of course, the news media won't let this go. They've got a bone in their teeth. And John Gorton, who's just been appointed to the post of government leader in the Senate for 9 days, actually says, we're going to die in the ditch over this, and this issue is not worth dying in the ditch. I'm going to find those documents and I'm going to table them. And he did. And it was enormously embarrassing to Harold Holt and Peter Howson in the short term. Well, we don't know how more embarrassing it would be for Harold Holt because unfortunately he died just weeks later. But what it did do is it killed the issue dead. Yes, Labor did score some points on the day, but in the weeks and months after, it was a forgotten issue. So John Gorton did what we do in modern PR. You own the problem, you get ahead of the story, and you kill it dead. You don't lie and deny. That's old PR. New PR is to fess up, apologise, and fix it and move on. And so John Gorton was acutely aware of that. Now, because he had so sensationally tabled these documents and almost in defiance of his own Prime Minister, he was all over the television, radio and newspaper coverage. So therefore, he became one of the most recognisable Australian faces in virtually no time at all. So he went from a junior minister to government leader in the Senate to prime ministerial candidate in the space of a couple of months.
Amazing. Yeah.
It was amazing. And again, it was compromised, though. When Harold Holt did die, John Gorton made no secret that he would love the top job. But again, he was an outsider. He was relatively junior in the pecking order. And William McMahon was deputy leader. He was the next logical cab off the rank. And also he had a rival in Paul Hasluck, who was a very senior minister and very much like in the Menzies mould. So a lot of people thought it'd be Billy McMahon or Paul Hasluck. Well, interestingly, the Country Party leader, Jack McEwen, a very dour, firm and stern figure, said, I will not serve in any cabinet headed by Billy McMahon. Now, there's been lots of allegations over the years that Billy McMahon was a leaker to the press and undermined his cabinet colleagues, plus McEwen was a trade protectionist, Billy McMahon was a free trader. They absolutely despised each other. And this was a kind of early political or constitutional crisis. It was a big scandal at the time. And so McMahon was knocked out. So it was really between Paul Hasluck, the senior, and John Gorton, the junior. And, of course, there was a couple of others like Billy Snedden, who was seen as too young and inexperienced. And what happened was that, again, John Gorton was a political pragmatist with modern thinking. He knew that to win your colleagues' support for the Prime Ministership, you have to court them. You have to lobby them. Whereas Paul Hasluck was old school. He said, I don't need to do any of that rubbish. My reputation speaks for itself. But that's not enough in politics. You need to convince people.
Yeah. So,
and again, the allegation was that even at Holt's funeral, John Gorton was talking to people, whispering to them about the need for a strong leader like him. So when it came to the ballots, John Gorton did win convincingly in January of 68. And interestingly, he actually was still a senator for a few days. So that's under convention, that's not allowed. But he didn't resign his Senate position for a few days until after he was sworn in. And, of course, he was Prime Minister then without a seat in either house until the by-election in Harold Holt's old seat of Higgins. So
lucky he won it. Liberal Party just lost the seat of Higgins the other day. So
that would be very interesting, wouldn't it? What would have happened?
Been very
Interestingly, John Gorton actually got a primary swing to him, and a big swing to him in that by-election, which is something you'd rarely see in a swing to governments in a by-election anyway, and it was a massive field. So there must have been an enthusiasm that this guy we like.
Yeah.
This guy is different. This guy is a refreshing change of direction. So John Gorton throughout 1968 was enormously popular. And there was a lot of speculation that he would call an election towards the end of 68, which would be 12 months early. And had he done so, Australian history would have been changed. He would have won that election easily. Gough Whitlam would have been beaten, and maybe the Labor Party would have changed leaders, thinking that Gough Whitlam was unelectable. But the fact that he didn't call that election, despite great expectation, meant journalists also then thought this guy's a bit flaky. He said he was going to call an election, and he didn't. And that's so in 69, the media starts to become quite critical of Gorton as well. So 69 was a dream year for Gorton. 69, the wheels start to come off. And
what were his major policy differences from his predecessors? I mean, you talk of Gortonism. He believed much more in the sort of centralisation of power. He thought the states, had their day, and perhaps maybe if he'd stayed on longer, we would have seen some sort of reform of the federation there. But he had quite a different approach, didn't he, from his predecessors when it came to a range of policies?
Well, again, I talk about Gortonism in the book, but again, we've got to remember that it's not a political science term, really. It is it's something that journalists invented at the time. Gortonism, this man coming in, putting his stamp on Australian politics. So what is Gortonism? Gortonism, I think, is a combination. I call it an attempt at transformational leadership. And in politics, not just Australian politics, but in politics, we talk about transformational versus transactional. Transactional leadership really is just getting through the day with a short-term vision about getting through the end of the media cycle and trying to win the next election. Doing a business deal with voters, giving the voters just enough what they need in order for us to give them, for them to give us their vote at the next election. And nothing else really changes. Most politicians are transactional. Occasionally you see a politician who says, I want to do more than that. I want to leave this country a better place. I want to change society. I want to transform it. And in so doing, they have to disrupt what Graham Little calls disrupt the ensemble, disrupt the status quo. And that, of course, that ruffles feathers. And John Gorton did ruffle a lot of feathers, especially in the Liberal Party. I think John Gorton had more enemies in the Liberal Party than outside it. And the Liberal establishment, the Conservative Liberals, the Paul Haslucks and so on, the Peter Howsons, really despise John Gorton for that. So Gortonism is a transformational approach to change the country, which moulds a whole range of small L social liberal policy issues with, as you say, a desire for centralising authority. So the smaller issues you talked about were things we've already talked about. He wanted to engage in the arts. Not many people know, for example, that John Gorton was a poet. and he had poetry published. And yet to listen to him, he sounded like a guy. He said he'd liked a guy who liked a beer and to sit down and watch Westerns on TV. So he tried to convince people he was uncultured, but in reality, he was very cultured. He wanted to help Indigenous Australians. He was a big supporter of women in politics. In later life, not while he was Prime Minister, this would have been far too controversial, but in later life in the 1970s, he championed gay rights and drug law reform, which is, again, still decades before his time.
Yeah.
He championed education, of course. He believed in the equality of education, getting poor kids into quality schools and universities. He was also an early advocate of independence for Papua New Guinea. So he started what Gough Whitlam finished. He was a self-described owl. Now, that's an old political trick. When people say, are you a hawk or a dove? In defence, they say, well, I'm an owl, I'm wise. But there's no doubt that he started his political career in the 40s and 50s as a hawk. He finished it in the 60s and 70s as a dove. So he quickly realised the folly of the Vietnam War, the folly of conscription, and so on. So there was a range of small L liberal, social liberal issues. So we might call that ideological leadership. But he also engaged in an operational leadership, how he did the job day to day. And he believed in strong central federal government. And again, you look at his speeches going back to the early 50s in the Senate, where he talked about, we're all Australians. We're not a collection of 6 states. We are all Australians. And he always advocated a central role for Canberra. And that's why he relished the education portfolio, so he could exercise that. One education policy across the country. The difference between someone like Gorton and Menzies, however, is that Menzies too was something of a small C centralist. He expanded the power of the Commonwealth and universities. He built up Canberra from a small country town to a big city. He expanded the Commonwealth public service. Menzies didn't want Australia to become a confederate like we often see in the United States, where Washington is powerless against the South. He wanted an Australia that was united with little difference between the states, when everyone treated equally. The difference is that Menzies didn't get on use a megaphone to scream across the state, across the country, I'm picking a fight with the premiers. Menzies did this below the radar, and he did things with grants to the states and so on. And Holt did it too. Holt was a great belief in central government. The difference with Gorton is that he got on the bullhorn, got on his megaphone, and told, and said, "No, I'm all about this. I'm all about Canberra. I'm a centralist. I'm proud of it. The state premiers can go to hell." And of course, that just raised the ire, particularly of people like Joe Bjelke-Petersen in Queensland. Of course, when the Bjelke-Petersen government wanted to mine the Great Barrier Reef for oil, Gorton came out and said, "No, the Great Barrier Reef belongs to Australia and the world. It doesn't belong to Queensland. You can't do that." But there were many instances like that. So that's what Gortonism is. Gortonism is this attempt to change Australia, and I argue that he took it from a capital C conservative to a small L liberal Australia. And the fact that he could do that successfully, and he didn't do it alone, of course, the cultural zeitgeist was changing, the tall poppy syndrome was changing, the cultural cringe was changing. Australian entertainers were no longer having to go to Britain. Australians were celebrating their own arts and culture. The minerals boom was booming. People were proud of mining their own and selling their own minerals. So he didn't do it single-handedly, but he certainly steered that new Australian nationalism, and that it was okay to be proud to be Australian. You don't have to be ashamed of being Australian. So he wedded Australian values to small L liberal progressive values, to that all of this has to be steered from Canberra.
So, really, you paint a picture of someone whose legacy should be better remembered than it indeed is, I think.
Absolutely.
Decisions like that over the Great Barrier Reef, can you imagine the direction of the country if we hadn't saved the Great Barrier Reef? Yeah,
absolutely. And again, it was a fairly controversial decision at the time, because going back to, I think it was 1970, that was a time when we were still thinking, trees are useless. Let's knock them down and build another car park. Car parks are good. Trees are useless.
Yeah.
That was the thinking. Concrete is good. Concrete is modern. And it wasn't until well into the 70s that you've got environmental groups becoming the forerunners of the Greens and so on. So this was again a fairly controversial thing to do, and to stand up against a powerful and popular state premier like Bjelke-Petersen was also very, very brave. But I think you're quite right. So many Australians haven't even heard of John Gorton, and those who have probably only know a couple of things, like that he liked to smoke and a drink, that he had a war-damaged face, or a couple of things like that. They don't really know. And I've had a couple of emails from people after they've read the book and said, I didn't realise John Gorton did so much. They always throw John Gorton. They always say Harold Holt, John Gorton, Jack McEwen, and Billy McMahon. They're the ones who they were all placeholders between Menzies and Whitlam. And, of course, none of that is true. All four of those men made an important contribution to political and cultural life.
Absolutely. Well, tell me, Paul, about the way he ran government. So he has this very famous, a personal private secretary, Ainsley Gotto, who sort of becomes famous in her own right and quite a sort of figure in Canberra. And of course, journalists really focus on her. She's quite striking looking. She wears those big sunglasses, doesn't she? Is it? But there's sort of allegations, and I think this is also part of the culture of the times, the views on women and the place of women in the times. There's a view that she's a bit above her station in terms of her influence on John Gorton, and then there's sort of scandalous rumours that she was in a relationship with him. Tell me, what was the nature of this relationship with Ainsley Gotto?
Well, it's been a long-standing rumour in Australian politics that, yes, John Gorton was having a sexual relationship with his 20-year-old principal private secretary, which is a very senior position, basically the gatekeeper to the Prime Minister's office. And so it's not a secretary in terms of, just someone who sits outside and types up memos. This is a principal private secretary in the sense that they are the organiser of the Prime Minister's office, and as the gatekeeper. And again, you're quite right. That role is normally reserved for a man, and a man probably over the age of 45 with tertiary qualifications. And John Gorton broke convention here by hiring a woman who was only 22, who was also, that most people agreed was very attractive, very clever, very articulate, extremely self-confident, who called ministers who are 3 times her age by their Christian names, and who would say to people, no, you're not seeing John. You're not seeing the Prime Minister, but no, John doesn't want to see you. And it was even alleged that sometimes he would say to Betty, no, Betty, John's too busy to see you. And this really upset a lot of people, including Dudley Urban, who a minister who was dumped from cabinet after 1969. And when he was asked by journalists, why were you dumped, he said, well, it wiggles, it's shapely, and its name is Ainsley Gotto. So there was an allegation that Gotto even advised Gorton on cabinet composition. I don't think that's true. Now, as to the allegations of a sexual liaison, I think we can conclude that the rumour is false. Ian Hancock, who has written 2 excellent biographies, one of Gorton and one of Ainsley Gotto herself, and Ainsley has sadly passed away in fairly recent times, so she's not here to defend herself. He delved deeply into this and found no evidence whatsoever of it. Interestingly, Ainsley Gotto was actually in a relationship with Race Matthews, who was a later Labor Victorian politician, and he was Gough Whitlam's principal private secretary, or at least a senior Labor members. I think it was the opposition, is principal private secretary. So in many ways, that's much more scandalous. So who knows what, a Labor senior figure and a Liberal senior figure, what sort of pillow talk passed between them? All sorts of secrets could have been divulged. So I think that's far more interesting and salacious, isn't it? But there's no doubt that John Gorton did have an eye for women. He did admit having, again, extramarital affairs, as I said. And there are a couple of other occasions in where Gorton seemed to have embarrassed himself or caused unnecessary scandal. One was when Lisa Minnelli, Judy Garland's daughter, came to Australia and performed at the Checkers nightclub. And Gorton went backstage afterwards and just talked to her. And she was a very young woman, very attractive. And this was reported as scandalous. But again, there were other people in the dressing room, so nothing untoward could have happened. Gorton was just a fan. But a much more problematic one was, again, right towards the end of 1969, when the wheels were already starting to fall off. Gorton's public opinion and public approval was starting to be tarnished a little bit. And he had took a young journalist by the name of Geraldine Willacy, which is, again, part of the famous Willacy family, and daughter of Don Willacy, who was a Labor senator with whom Gorton had a huge falling out with. And he took young Geraldine, who had attended a ball. After the ball, he took her in his car to see the American ambassador. And this was after midnight. And, what's the Prime Minister doing knocking on the ambassador's door after midnight? Again, it was something to do with American bombing of Vietnam. The Prime Minister needed an urgent update. What's he doing bringing a journalist, like a young woman journalist, something of the age around 19 in the dead of night? So that was a huge scandal. And there's no doubt that affected.
Was the allegation he was drunk or what?
Well, the allegation, we still don't know really. I think the jury's still out as to whether Geraldine asked for a lift or John Gorton volunteered the lift. If he volunteered the lift, it has, some would say creepy overtones if he had done that. But there's, the fact that they were in the car, he wasn't with his wife, he was with a 19-year-old attractive journalist, and going to, again, the most inappropriate places, a very sensitive place with private conversations. And again, it was alleged, it seems to have occurred, I think there's some evidence for this, that he actually spent more time talking to Geraldine and giving her drinks than the ambassador. And he apparently had said to Geraldine of his desire to get out of Vietnam as quickly as possible, which is an incredibly insensitive thing to say to anyone, because of the people weren't, even though the attitude towards the Vietnam War was souring, it wasn't, we still hadn't got to the point where we had to get out now. Gorton controversially put a ceiling on the troop commitment. The 3rd Battalion was enough, and when that's returned, there'll be no more. But it wasn't until William McMahon withdrew the troops in late 72 that we were finally evacuated. So to come out and say, we want to get out of Vietnam was still a controversial thing to 69. So to said that indiscreetly to a young journalist is, again, more evidence that there's a difference between his very admirable ideological leadership about building a better, fairer, more egalitarian Australia and his operational leadership, which was very, and this is a word that John Gorton used to me personally when I interviewed him years ago, lackadaisical. He admitted to me that he was often lackadaisical, that he would be late for meetings. He would much prefer to talk to a group of school children on a tour of Parliament House than to go talk to his cabinet colleagues. Again, not to put too fine a point on it, he was often hungover.
Yeah.
Journalist Mungo McCallum called this Gorton flu. He was very lackadaisical. He did, and again, it was this insouciance. He didn't really care about how the Australian people, his colleagues, or the media saw him. He wanted to be. He didn't see there was any difference between a private and public lives. He was who he was, and again, and that's in one sense that's admirable, but in another sense, it sort of gives the impression that he wasn't serious enough about the job. And I would tend to agree that I'm very admirable and very admiring of his ideological leadership, but I'd be the first to say that his operational leadership, his day-to-day management of affairs were poor. And if he'd attended to his operational leadership, if he'd shown more diligence in the job, if nothing else to win the confidence of his colleagues, he could have stayed around a lot longer and done a lot more for the party, his government and the country.
Well, things come up and stuck, of course, in 1969, don't they? So he has to contest the election and they do not do very well.
Huge swing against them, 7% swing against them, one of the biggest.
So they do pretty badly, but they win.
They just hang on.
In politics, a win is a win.
It is, indeed.
But soon after, he's knifed, and Billy McMahon takes the leadership. Why do you think this all came unstuck? Is it because he was just operationally not up to the job, had the ideas, but the execution was not there, too many distractions, lackadaisical, as he put it?
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons. We've got to remember that the Liberal Party, then as now, had at least two streams, Conservative and Liberal. So I would argue there are more streams today, but let's just focus on Conservative versus Liberal. Certain Conservatives, the Haslutt camp, were always worried about Gorton, at least the second iteration of Gorton. In his early days, he was, profoundly anti-communist, suspicious of China. So he could quite comfortably sit in that cohort, that faction. But as the 60s wear on and, when he announces himself as a candidate for Prime Minister in 1968, he actually says, I am to the left of many of my colleagues. which would have raised a lot of hackles and raised a lot of concerns among Conservatives. But he did this to send a message to Labor voters who might want to vote for him as well. And it seemed to work. He was going to be his own man. So we've got to remember that even before he came to the Prime Ministership, many members of the Liberal Party room were sort of cautious about this guy. He's not really one of us. Then you've got, but I suppose they put that to a side as 1968 as his public opinion is soaring. But then as you see him, as you say, engaging operationally poorly, being late for meetings, and again, it was said to me that, Gorton would have an idea in the bath and then go to Cabinet a couple of hours later and say, this is what we're doing. And, so without consulting Cabinet colleagues. So he believed in prime ministerial government, indeed presidential government. You're expected to lead or get out, Gorton said to me. So he didn't really believe in primus inter pares, first among equals. The Prime Minister's the boss and ministers do as they're told. And, of course, that upset even the Liberals in the party room. So he did get a lot of people offside, not just ideologically because he was a Liberal but a Conservative, but also organisationally, operationally, because he could run things in a fairly lackadaisical ad hoc manner. And then, of course, there were the scandals, being, around women, drinking too much, picking fights with journalists, which he called slimy white things that crawl out of gutters. He wasn't very good at servicing what we call the PowerPoints. He only had 2 PowerPoints, really, and that was favoured members of his cabinet. So he ran a kitchen cabinet and the public at large through television. There were only 2 PowerPoints he really worried about. He didn't really curry favour with all of the cabinet. He curried favour with some backbenchers, but again, it was more of a divide and conquer. He didn't curry favour with the media. He didn't curry favour with the public service. He didn't curry favour with the DLP or the Country Party. So all of these PowerPoints need to be serviced in the coalition. And at the end of the day, if there are too many people who are against you, the knives will come out. And this came to a head in 1969 when Conservative critics, led by a Conservative journalist who wrote a book called The Gorton Experiment, Alan Reid, the Red Fox, very senior figure in the Canberra Press Gallery, wrote a book after the 1969 election called The Gorton Experiment. Gorton was like a schoolboy experimenting with chemicals, causing explosions, and didn't really care. And the experiment failed. And the proof of that is in the 7-point swing against the coalition. So there became a folklore for decades. And even to this day, you talk to some old Liberals and they say Gorton was responsible for the swing. Now, of course, we know that's nonsense. No single factor can influence an election. Again, some people would want to say Scott Morrison's personality was responsible for the 2022 swing against the Liberals. It's nonsense to say that it was solely about Scott Morrison. There's a myriad of factors. Climate change, clearly it was an important factor for the Teals, and so on. So it's a nonsense to attribute big electoral movements to a single individual. But that sort of became folklore. So John Gorton's public opinion, the party's public opinion continues to decline through 1970 as Gough Whitlam starts to score points in the parliament. But interestingly, the gap between Whitlam and Gorton, it narrows by the end of 1970. So Gorton recovers a bit of ground personally in late 1970.
Interesting.
But the Conservative forces again gather strength, and this is now led by Malcolm Fraser. Malcolm Fraser had a fight with General Daly. It was a fairly minor skirmish, a bit of a verbal skirmish, and he went to John Gorton to complain about this, and he wanted Gorton to support him. But Daly and Gorton were friends, and Gorton wouldn't support Malcolm Fraser. I mean, the two never really liked each other anyway. And then Malcolm Fraser resigned as Defence Minister in disgust and says, I can't be in a government with this man who shows such disloyalty. And that was the beginning of the end. There were enough Conservatives who were worried about all of those things we talked about, ideological and operational leadership, and a spill motion was brought forward in March 71, and Gorton could no longer resist. He had to face this spill motion. And the really interesting part of this story, of course, is I think most Australians who know political history well would know that there were 66 members in the Liberal caucus, in the Liberal party room, senators in the House, and Gorton very foolishly moved a confidence motion in himself.
Oh.
What he should have done is he should have waited for someone to move a no confidence motion, because it's harder to get people to come out and say, I have no confidence. But when people say, do you have confidence? It's easy for people to say, no, I don't. So that was his first mistake. The party room divided 33 all.
Mm.
And interestingly, a Gorton ally, the member for Herbert, was sick and absent. So it wouldn't have been 30. It would have been 34, 33. And then Gorton says, a tie is not confidence. And as he chaired the meeting, and he said, I'm going to use a casting vote to vote against myself. And he voted himself from the Prime Ministership. He could have said, well, we're going to have a second ballot. He could have said, and that was a ballot on the voices. It wasn't even a secret ballot. He could have had a secret ballot, but it was a ballot on the voices. He could have called a new ballot, or he could have suspended it and said, let's do this when the member for Herbert returns. But no, he acted unilaterally and said, no, the party room doesn't have confidence in me. Again, Gorton broke party rules because as chair, he had a deliberative vote, but not a casting vote. But he gave himself a casting vote to throw himself out of office. So he's a remarkable man right to the end.
Yeah. Well, I guess he saw, given 33 had voted against him, he saw the writing on the wall, didn't he? And,
indeed.
Yeah. Fell on his sword. Well, what a remarkable career up until then. There's so many more questions I wanted to ask you, Paul, about his post prime ministerial life when he turns against the Liberal Party, what could have been on nuclear energy. He was a big fan of nuclear energy, but we will stop there and perhaps continue another day. Thank you so much, Paul Williams, for such an enlightening and very interesting discussion on Australia's Prime Minister John Gorton.
It's been my pleasure, Georgina. Thanks for having me.
The Afternoon Light podcast is brought to you by the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. You can find more about the Institute and our podcast at robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. We're also on Twitter, on Facebook and LinkedIn. We look forward to you joining our show next week. Thank you.